Hi BookTube, and welcome to another Middlemarch meditation. Today we're going to look at the first part of chapter 31, and I confess that yes, I have divided up the chapter between two episodes with a strategy in mind, and maybe I should question my methods, because my strategy is to prolong suspense, and yet I think, a lot of people watching these probably have read Middlemarch already, know exactly how important chapter 31 is. And yet, I also know the whole of chapter 31. I have read it ahead, and even though I know, part of what makes this chapter satisfying is that little bit of anticipation. Without further ado, we get right into the reading. How will you know the pitch of that great bell too large for you to stir? Let but a flute play 'neath the fine mixed metal. Listen close, till the right note flows forth a silvery rill. Then shall the huge bell tremble, then the mass, with myriad waves concurrent, shall respond in low, soft unison. Lidgett that evening spoke to Miss Vincey of Mrs. Casaubon and laid some emphasis on the strong feeling she appeared to have for that formal, studious man 30 years older than herself. "Of course she is devoted to her husband," said Rosamond, implying a notion of necessary sequence which the scientific man regarded as the prettiest possible for a woman, but she was thinking at the same time that it was not so very melancholy to be mistress of Lowick Manor with a husband likely to die soon. "Do you think her very handsome?" "She certainly is handsome, but I have not thought about it," said Lidgett. "I suppose it would be unprofessional," said Rosamond, dimpling, "but how your practice is spreading! You were called in before to the Chethams, I think, and now the Casaubons." "Yes," said Lidgett in a tone of compulsory admission, "but I don't really like attending such people so well as the poor. The cases are more monotonous, and one has to go through more fuss and listen more deferentially to nonsense." "Not more than in Middlemarch," said Rosamond, "and at least you go through wide corridors and have the scent of rose-leaves everywhere." "That is true, Mademoiselle de Montmorency," said Lidgett, just bending his head to the table and lifting with his fourth finger her delicate handkerchief, which lay at the mouth of her reticule, as if to enjoy its scent, while he looked at her with a smile. But this agreeable holiday freedom with which Lidgett hovered about the flower of Middlemarch could not continue indefinitely. It was not more possible to find social isolation in that town than elsewhere, and two people persistently flirting could by no means escape from, quote, "the various entanglements, weights, blows, clashings, motions, by which things severally go on." Whatever Miss Vincey did must be remarked, and she was perhaps the more conspicuous to admirers and critics because just now Mrs. Vincey, after some struggle, had gone with Fred to stay a little while at Stone Court, there being no other way of at once gratifying old Featherstone and keeping watch against Mary Garth, who appeared a less tolerable daughter-in-law in proportion as Fred's illness disappeared. Anne Bulstrode, for example, came a little oftener into Lowick Gate to see Rosamond, now she was alone, for Mrs. Bulstrode had a true sisterly feeling for her brother, always thinking that he might have married better, but wishing well to the children. Now, Mrs. Bulstrode had a long-standing intimacy with Mrs. Plymdale. They had nearly the same preferences in silks, patterns for underclothing, china-ware, and clergymen. They confided their little troubles of health and household management to each other, and various little points of superiority on Mrs. Bulstrode's side, namely, a more decided seriousness, more admiration for mind, and a house outside the town sometimes served to give colour to their conversation without dividing them, well-meaning women both, knowing very little of their own motives. Mrs. Bulstrode, paying a morning visit to Mrs. Plymdale, happened to say that she could not stay longer because she was going to see poor Rosamond. "Why do you say poor Rosamond?" said Mrs. Plymdale, a round-eyed, sharp little woman like a tamed falcon. "She is so pretty, and has been brought up in such thoughtlessness. The mother, you know, had always that levity about her which makes me anxious for the children." "Well, Harriet, if I am to speak my mind," said Mrs. Plymdale, with emphasis, "I might say anybody would suppose you and Mr. Bulstrode would be delighted with what has happened, for you have done everything to put Mr. Lidgett forward." "Selina, what do you mean?" said Mrs. Bulstrode in genuine surprise. "Not but what I am truly thankful for Ned's sake," said Mrs. Plymdale. "He could certainly better afford to keep such a wife than some people can, but I should wish him to look elsewhere. Still, a mother has anxieties, and some young men would take to a bad life in consequence. Besides, if I was obliged to speak, I should say I was not fond of strangers coming into a town." "I don't know, Selina," said Mrs. Bulstrode, with a little emphasis in her turn. "Mr. Bulstrode was a stranger here at one time. Abraham and Moses were strangers in the land, and we are told to entertain strangers, and especially," she added after a slight pause, "when they are unexceptionable. I was not speaking in a religious sense, Harriet. I spoke as a mother. Selina, I am sure you have never heard me say anything against a niece of mine marrying your son." "Oh, it is pride in Miss Vincey. I am sure it is nothing else," said Mrs. Plymdale, who had never before given all her confidence to Harriet on this subject. "No young man in Middlemarch was good enough for her. I have heard her mother say as much. That is not a Christian spirit, I think. But now, from all I hear, she has found a man as proud as herself." "You don't mean that there is anything between Rosamond and Mr. Lidgett?" said Mrs. Bulstrode, rather mortified at finding out her own ignorance. "Is it possible you don't know, Harriet?" "Oh, I go about so little, and I am not fond of gossip. I really never hear any. You see so many people that I don't see. Your circle is rather different from ours." "Well, but your own niece, and Mr. Bulstrode's great favourite, and yours too, I am sure, Harriet. I thought at one time you meant him for Kate when she is a little older." "I don't believe there can be anything serious at present," said Mrs. Bulstrode. "My brother would certainly have told me." "Well, people have different ways, but I understand that nobody can see Miss Vincey and Mr. Lidgett together without taking them to be engaged. However, it is not my business. Shall I put up the pattern of mittens?" After this, Mrs. Bulstrode drove to her niece with a mind newly weighted. She was herself handsomely dressed, but she noticed, with a little more regret than usual, that Rosamond, who was just come in and met her in walking dress, was almost as expensively equipped. Mrs. Bulstrode was a feminine, smaller edition of her brother, and had none of her husband's low-toned pallor. She had a good, honest glance, and used no circumlocution. "You are alone, I see, my dear," she said, as they entered the drawing-room together, looking round gravely. Rosamond felt sure that her aunt had something particular to say, and they sat down near each other. Nevertheless, the quilling inside Rosamond's bonnet was so charming that it was impossible not to desire the same kind of thing for Kate, and Mrs. Bulstrode's eyes, which were rather fine, rolled round that ample quilled circuit while she spoke. "I have just heard something about you that has surprised me very much, Rosamond." "What is that, aunt?" Rosamond's eyes also were roaming over her aunt's large embroidered collar. "I can hardly believe it, that you should be engaged without my knowing it, without your father's telling me." Here Mrs. Bulstrode's eyes finally rested on Rosamond's, who blushed deeply and said, "I am not engaged, aunt." "How is it that everyone says so, then? That is the town's talk." "The town's talk is of very little consequence, I think," said Rosamond, inwardly gratified. "Oh, my dear, be more thoughtful. Don't despise your neighbors so. Remember, you are turned 22 now, and you will have no fortune. Your father, I am sure, will not be able to spare you anything. Mr. Lidgett is very intellectual and clever. I know there is an attraction in that. I like talking to such men myself, and your uncle finds him very useful. But the profession is a poor one here. To be sure, this life is not everything, but it is seldom a medical man has true religious views. There is too much pride of intellect, and you are not fit to marry a poor man." "Mr. Lidgett is not a poor man, aunt. He has very high connections. He told me himself he was poor. That is because he is used to people who have a high style of living." "My dear Rosamond, you must not think of living in high style." Rosamond looked down and played with her reticule. She was not a fiery young lady and had no sharp answers, but she meant to live as she pleased. "Then is it really true?" said Mrs. Bulstrode, looking very earnestly at her niece. "You are thinking of Mr. Lidgett. There is some understanding between you, though your father doesn't know. Be open, my dear Rosamond. Mr. Lidgett has really made you an offer?" Poor Rosamond's feelings were very unpleasant. She had been quite easy as to Lidgett's feeling and intention, but now, when her aunt put this question, she did not like being unable to say yes. Her pride was hurt, but her habitual control of manner helped her. "Pray, excuse me, aunt, I would rather not speak on the subject." "You would not give your heart to a man without a decided prospect, I trust, my dear, and think of the 2 excellent offers I know that you have refused, and one still within your reach, if you will not throw it away. I knew a very great beauty who married badly at last by doing so. Mr. Ned Plymdale is a nice young man, some might think good-looking, and an only son, and a large business of that kind is better than a profession. Not that marrying is everything. I would have you seek first the kingdom of God, but a girl should keep her heart within her own power. I should never give in to Mr. Ned Plymdale if it were. I have already refused him. If I loved, I should love at once and without change," said Rosamond, with a great sense of being a romantic heroine and playing the part prettily. "I see how it is, my dear," said Mrs. Bulstrode, in a melancholy voice, rising to go. "You have allowed your affections to be engaged without return." "No, indeed, aunt," said Rosamond with emphasis. "Then you are quite confident that Mr. Lidgett has a serious attachment to you?" Rosamond's cheeks by this time were persistently burning, and she felt much mortification. She chose to be silent, and her aunt went away all the more convinced. Mr. Bulstrode, in things worldly and indifferent, was disposed to do what his wife bade him, and she now, without telling her reasons, desired him on the next opportunity to find out in conversation with Mr. Lidgett whether he had any intention of marrying soon. The result was a decided negative. Mr. Bulstrode, on being cross-questioned, showed that Lidgett had spoken as no man would who had any attachment that could issue in matrimony. Mrs. Bulstrode now felt that she had a serious duty before her, and she soon managed to arrange a tete-a-tete with Lidgett, in which she passed from inquiries about Fred Vincey's health and expressions of her sincere anxiety for her brother's large family to general remarks on the dangers which lay before young people with regard to their settlement in life. Young men were often wild and disappointing, making little return for the money spent on them, and a girl was exposed to many circumstances which might interfere with her prospects, especially when she has great attractions and her parents see much company, said Mrs. Bulstrode. Gentlemen pay her attention and engross her all to themselves for the mere pleasure of the moment, and that drives off others. I think it is a heavy responsibility, Mr. Lidgett, to interfere with the prospects of any girl. Here Mrs. Bulstrode fixed her eyes on him with an unmistakable purpose of warning, if not of rebuke. "Clearly," said Lidgett, looking at her, perhaps even staring a little in return. "On the other hand, a man must be a great coxcomb to go about with a notion that he must not pay attention to a young lady, lest she should fall in love with him, or lest others should think she must. Oh, Mr. Lidgett, you know well what your advantages are. You know that our young men here cannot cope with you. Where you frequent a house, it may militate very much against a girl's making a desirable settlement in life, and prevent her from accepting offers, even if they are made." Lidgett was less flattered by his advantage over the Middlemarch Orlandos than he was annoyed by the perception of Mrs. Bulstrode's meaning. He felt that she had spoken as impressively as it was necessary to do, and that in using the superior word militate, she had thrown a noble drapery over a mass of particulars which were still evident enough. Lidgett was fuming a little, pushed his hair back with one hand, felt curiously in his waistcoat pocket with the other, and then stooped to beckon the tiny black spaniel, which had the insight to decline his hollow caresses. It would not have been decent to go away, because he had been dining with other guests and had just taken tea. But Mrs. Bulstrode, having no doubt that she had been understood, turned the conversation. We leave it there with Mrs. Bulstrode feeling that she has achieved a purpose. And we'll go back to the beginning now and look at that epigraph. Once again, I thought, there won't be much here to talk about this epigraph. It was clear that it was a verse written by Eliot herself, and I thought, lovely. And then I read it, and even reading it made an impression on me, so I'm going to read it again. "How will you know the pitch of that great bell too large for you to stir? Let but a flute play 'neath the fine mixed metal. Listen close, till the right note flows forth, a silvery rill. Then shall the huge bell tremble. Then the mass, with myriad waves concurrent, shall respond in low, soft unison." Regular Middlemarch meditation viewers may recognize the name Adam Roberts when I say it, because Roberts has written a book which is freely available online and looks in detail at a number of Eliot's epigraphs. For those hearing Roberts' name for the first time, I will leave a link in the description box to this book that you can read on Internet Archive. I think it's mandatory reading for anybody who wants to go in depth into Middlemarch. Roberts begins by saying that this subject of resonance and frequencies which could move objects to make responding frequencies was something that was being closely studied in the 1830s. And he quotes a work of general science now, and I'm reading the footnote in Roberts' book on page 120, where he says, and he's quoting now from a work of general science, "I was anxious to ascertain what relation the secondary tones of a large bell bore to its fundamental note, and for this purpose I availed myself of the excellent musical ear of my friend Mr. Dodd during his too short sojourn with me, and we went, accompanied by a flute, to the large bell of Salisbury Cathedral." And that was Charles Tomlinson, and it was called Mr. Tomlinson's Experiments and Observations on Visible Vibration, and it was published in the Records of General Science in 1835. Now, Charles Tomlinson was a teacher of experimental science at a school in Salisbury, and his scientific legacy was more about the surface tension on liquids. But I think it would be a safe bet that this publication, this Records of General Science, was one that Eliot's partner, Marian Evans' partner, George Henry Lewes, subscribed to, and that the copies were in the house. This is too close to the circumstances of her little verse for me to accept that she hadn't read that exact paragraph. And the more I went back and read this verse at the head of the chapter, the more I thought, this is my favorite, I think, so far, of all the epigraphs that Eliot has written herself rather than quoting from other works. I like it because Eliot's taken what is a simple fact that you could say in a rather dull sentence, if you like. And she's revealed it using poetry. And so, yes, it adds to your scientific knowledge, but it's just, it appears as though the quote has come from a larger poem. And so you think of it not so much as, oh, this is just expounding a scientific fact. You think, no, what is being described in this verse is going to be used in the rest of the poem as a comparison, as an extended metaphor. And so I imagined that the rest of this imaginary poem, which doesn't exist, would go on to talk about other kinds of resonances. What is there in the softer sciences, or just in human life in general, in our less scientifically observed lives? What is there that looks like the same phenomenon that is happening when we play a flute near a great bell, and we get that frequency just right on the flute, and sure enough, it sets off vibrations in this incredible large object that you think, how could you get it to tremble? How could such a small instrument and a single note get the molecules within that great heavy bell to respond with a replying frequency? And this is a digression. While I was writing this part of the script, I kid you not, the bells of the Church of St. James, that's the patron saint of the town I live in. Apparently, that's what I learned from reading Mortimer's book about medieval England. They started to ring. And the person who watches television thinks that the church here has 4 bells, and the music that they make together is the most transporting sound, a resonance that it might not be scientifically demonstrable, but I don't know what else you would call it. It made me shiver. And then made me feel kind of serene. So I don't know if that was also a kind of resonance and response. And okay, it's a cultural thing. If you've never heard church bells, maybe you wouldn't think anything of hearing this sound for the first time. But as a cultural phenomenon, it does have an effect. And I thought that was interesting, since we're discussing this extended metaphor of sending out vibrations as such, and then receiving almost replying vibrations from another object that is struck by those frequencies. Adam Roberts goes on then to quote 2 other works. One is a work of theology, and I think this is interesting because they used Eliot's epigraph as a metaphor for the effect of Christian faith, almost suggesting that a believer's faith is a kind of vibration sent out that has a resonating effect on the Godhead, the power of the Godhead. It's like the sympathetic note of that flute, which causes a reaction in the great bell. Let me read you that quote, and I'll also put it on screen here so you get it in full. For example, the unsigned article in the Bible Christian magazine, issue 17, 1881, quotes Eliot's lines and adds, "Thus, the slightest touch of faith makes the nature of the Godhead quiver to the center." And that's Joseph William Reynolds' The Mystery of the Universe, Our Common Faith, published in London in 1884. And then Roberts also mentions that Henry Burton's work, The Gospel According to St. Luke, on page 74, quote these lines from Joseph William Reynolds and make a similar point. So it's interesting the effect that Eliot's words had and her completely made-up poem had. People were able to take it and find other interpretations for this phenomenon of resonance. And much later, in 2013, Evan Horowitz considers Eliot's epigraph as a kind of model for social response and change. And that's maybe even more significant. So now I'm switching the picture and giving you this footnote from Adam Roberts' work, where he's quoting Horowitz, and Horowitz is saying, if it is not immediately clear that these lines are about social form rather than, say, the acoustics of bells, the evidence is nonetheless there, most directly in that pointed word mass, and most profoundly in the final cadence, where the mass is made a chorus of individuals singing in low, soft unison. And that's Evan Horowitz, Industrialism and the Victorian Novel. And the moral, Roberts says, that Horowitz draws is that though the whole of society may seem overgrown and unwieldy. The right cause, the right ideal, the right note will show its resounding harmony. Now, I really like that last quote because I felt that chapter 31 is really a series of social vibrations sent out which get a response, and you can start to examine those. And that's why I divided the episodes in two as well, because I thought I want to take a close look at this business of sending out social vibrations. We all do it, don't we? We all are brought up within a cultural context, and we learn what that culture expects of us and what it doesn't, or what it hopes that we won't do. And then we make choices, don't we? We make choices about, well, will I do what my culture wants? And if we do, that sends out a certain kind of vibration, and we get vibrations back of approval, of, I don't know, sometimes we get rewarded with social vibrations coming back to us, or we choose to push against those norms. Maybe we feel we have no choice. Where we find ourselves and who we find ourselves to be means, I'm sorry, I can't go along with the majority opinion here. And then we have to cope with different kinds of vibrations coming back and hitting us. And that this business of being hit or struck by these social vibrations, as well as our own vibrations being sent out and striking others. This is a theme in chapter 31. And so I want to get picky and start to look at the different situations in which Eliot is describing this happening. And so the very first vibrations that Eliot's narrator describes is the effect that Mrs. Casaubon has had on Mr. Lidgett. So great that he actually feels, and maybe this is a little bit callous of him, he feels he should mention this in conversation with Rosamond. It's a bit strange. Of course, he is mentioning a married woman to her, so perhaps he thinks, well, there's no need for her to feel anything about me talking to her about another woman. And of course, also, what he's saying to her is implying that, well, we're not in love. There's nothing happening here that is serious that I should consider whether or not I speak to you about another woman. But it's interesting that even though he describes this, Rosamond responds, her vibrational responses as such are, first of all, to say, well, of course, a woman is devoted to her husband. I have been taught that, and I believe it. I believe that's true. So she's resonating with him in this way. But it's interesting that she wants to know whether Lidgett thinks that Dorothea is handsome. Funny that she should want to know that. And he says, he admits, yes, she is, but I haven't thought about it. Well, I mean, you've thought about it long enough to notice. That's all that Rosamond's probably asking. But it's interesting that the vibrations going back and forth, as though Rosamond's testing Lidgett's reactions to her various little points. Are we perhaps to see, are we in agreement on other smaller things? And is his affection for me? It's kind of fishing for a compliment. She must be careful about how she fishes for compliments. We've covered that in earlier chapters when we've looked at books of etiquette. You can't just ask someone to compliment your looks. You have to find an indirect way of getting them to do so. She doesn't get the compliment here, but she does go on then to praise him because he's being asked for by wealthy upper-class clients, people who are above Rosamond's station, people that Rosamond couldn't go and call upon. She can see that Lidgett has a way into their society, which excites her. Now, he's not so excited. He lets her know that, well, poor people, he seems to be saying, have more interesting illnesses. Okay, well, they probably have more illnesses, and that's probably interesting. So I guess he sees them as a better textbook. Okay. It's interesting. We won't comment on that more at length, but that says something, that he sees the poor as a better sort of basis for him to get more exposure to different illnesses and treating different illnesses. Rosamond, of course, has no idea that that's of any importance at all. All she wants to remark upon is, oh, but think of the lovely places with all the lovely things, with wide corridors and everything smelling of, she says, rose leaves. I am sure she means rose petals or there's always some sort of scent in the air. And Lidgett, I think, begins to catch on to her. Oh my goodness, you're so enamored by the fine things that people have. And so he teases her. He calls her Mademoiselle de Montmorency. Now, who's he referring to? Well, he's referring to Charlotte Marguerite Montmorency, who was a 17th century heiress. She was one of the French ducal family she came from. And she married Henri de Bourbon to become the Princesse de Condé. And also she was coveted by the French King Henry IV, who tried to make her his mistress, and this frustrated Henri de Bourbon so much that he actually moved away from Paris to keep his wife away from the king. Nevertheless, even in teasing her, Lidgett then does something which I'm sorry, everyone, but I felt this was sexual imagery that went on down in the bottom paragraph here, where it says, just bending his head to the table and lifting his fourth finger, her delicate handkerchief which lay at the mouth of her reticule, as if to enjoy its scent. Now, to me, this is very, very well done sexual erotic imagery. And let's look at why. First of all, Lidgett is using a finger, and I don't know whether the fourth finger is significant. Unfortunately, I did not look that up, and I should have done. But a finger can be, if I hold it upright, yes, a phallic symbol, right? Let's imagine that that's what it is. Let's now imagine that he's now fingering the handkerchief, which is like, flaps. I don't have to be more specific here, do I? Flaps that are coming out of an opening in Rosamond's little bag. Now, I just don't know. To me, I read that and I thought, oh, God, Eliot, she, while trying to be so delicate and Victorian, I'm not sure whether in the 19th century well-bred lady readers would have caught this. I think men might have thought, oh, that's very, it's edging on describing something else. It's teasing in a way. I should talk about reticule though, because some people may not know exactly what that is. It is a bag, a particular type of bag, and I'm going to put some pictures on screen now. Okay, reticules became fashionable in the Regency area, in other words, the early part of the 19th century. That's because dress silhouettes changed. They became a little bit more fitting. The fabrics became a lot more delicate. And so, whereas dresses used to have pockets where women would keep little personal possessions that they needed to carry around with them, the Regency dresses were just too delicate and floaty for that. A pocket would have looked really out of place. And so it became fashionable, therefore, for women to carry around with them little bags made in various ways with various fabrics, often handmade. If you remember Mr. Bingley in Pride and Prejudice, if you read that Jane Austen novel, he talked about netting purses as being an example of female accomplishments. And so these little purses were often embroidered. They were in different shapes and fabrics, depending upon, what's going to be carried in them and whether they were meant to be carried outdoors, indoors, whether they were for daytime or evening or for a particular season of the year. They differed. There's so many varieties, and you've just seen a few here. And so I thought you might, imagine a well-off young woman making many of these, to demonstrate her needlework skills and also to have just the right accessory on any occasion. So there's one of these delicate little drawstring bags that Rosamond has beside her, which is slightly open, and there's the handkerchief corners turning out. And I'm sorry, Lidgett bending down to finger that opening and the corners of the handkerchief, I just pulled back and thought, oh, Eliot is so sneaky. And yet that's a very effective metaphor, because you could argue that it's not. Someone could argue vociferously, no, that should just be taken literally. I thought, I do not think so. Eliot is too good for that. She's too good, she's too smart. So I think you can read into that something more erotic. The top of page 294 makes an announcement, though, after we see Rosamond and Lidgett flirting, and we even see this very well done erotic metaphor. The top of page 294 says, but this agreeable holiday freedom with which Lidgett hovered about the flower of Middlemarch. Again, that's a metaphor of a bee pollinating a flower. That has been a sexual image for I don't know how long. I think Eliot means it. It's like you are coming too close to something that you should not be doing without having, first of all, done something else, i.e. proposed marriage. And then we go on and we have this interesting situation where Mrs. Bulstrode and Mrs. Plymdale come together for a friendly visit, and the conversation gets on to Rosamond, and then it's revealed to Mrs. Bulstrode, because Mrs. Bulstrode lives slightly out of town. And also she's a bit religious, so there's people she probably wouldn't hang about and gossip with that Mrs. Plymdale might. But the view around town is that Lidget and Rosamond are spending enough time together that it is discouraging other suitors to try with Rosamond, because they begin to see, oh, I see how this is heading toward an engagement, and they're leaving her alone. And of course, both Mrs. Plymdale and Mrs. Bulstrode think, oh, I don't know about whether that particular relationship should develop toward marriage. I think it's a little too early, and I don't think it's the right match for these two. And so again, this is social vibrations, right? The actions of Rosamond and Lidget, which they think is just harmless. They think of it differently, we know that, but Lidget certainly thinks of it as just harmless fun that he can keep doing as long as he wishes, which of course is because he's a man. If he was a woman, he would know. That's why Rosamond thinks differently. She knows a woman can only receive so much of that kind of attention before people begin to say, and you are getting married when? Because this is coming too close to something which is only permitted after marriage. And so Rosamond understands that, and that's why Rosamond anticipates her social feeling is the next thing that's going to happen to me. She's got an expectation. The next vibration that should be coming her way soon is a proposal. Now, Lidget doesn't see it the same way, and that's probably why this flirting has carried on to a degree that those around Rosamond and Lidget, because they're watching the vibrations coming out from this couple as they observe them together, they think, no, something's not right. Something's not happening here as it should. All the signals are, this is a couple that are about to be engaged or are already engaged, and yet we know nothing of an engagement, and we're not sure there should be an engagement either. Different feelings going on there. At the same time, there's also this little subplot, which is mentioned in passing, because Rosamond is on her own in the house, and she's on her own because Mrs. Vincey has decided to accompany Fred and go to Stone Court. And that's because Peter Featherston, has asked for Fred urgently as soon as he can come. Please come. He must come. He's so important to me. And the Vinceys have interpreted that of course Fred is important because you intend to make him your heir. That's they're convinced of this. And so Mrs. Vincey is going with Fred. Perhaps she says she's doing it because Fred still needs looking after. I'm sure she's thought of some suitable excuse because Peter Featherston hasn't asked for her company. But her real intention is to stop any resonant contact between Fred and Mary Garth. So the situation that is allowed to go on between Lidget and Rosamond without being managed is definitely not being allowed to go on between Mary Garth and Fred, even though one would say, looking at both of these couples, neither of them is in a position to get married yet. There's financially speaking, in terms of being set up and being stable and being in a position where if children were conceived, there's a good house and home for them to be born into. That's definitely not the case. And in the paragraph at the top of page 294, Eliot uses another interesting quote, which is kind of covering the same themes and ideas as the epigraph. And it's where she says, the various entanglements, weights, blows, clashings, motions by which things severally go on. Okay, this is an interesting quote. It comes from an English translation of the Roman poet and philosopher Lucretius from his 6-book work called De Rerum Natura. Okay, my Latin is not rehearsed. Okay, so if I didn't do that correctly, apologies. There's an English translation of the whole work available on Internet Archive. I'm going to really push Internet Archive because I don't think people visit it a lot, and there are a lot of really good books on there. For example, Meg from Books Off the Beaten Path, we're going to do a buddy read of The Uninvited, and it's a book that was popular in the 60s. It's no longer in print. It's really difficult to get a hold of a copy in the UK unless you don't mind what you pay for it. And I thought, wow, I don't know if my book budget would extend to spending that much money on that one book. However, the Internet Archive had a fantastic copy, a Bantam paperback copy that they've literally scanned so I can see the cover art and what the inside of the pages look. And so that's how I'm going to be able to read the book, which otherwise I'd have to part with a lot of money to read. So I say go looking in there. If there's a book that you want and it's not in print, or to buy it online is like 40-50 pounds plus, and you think, oh, for heaven's sake, it's not worth that to me. I wouldn't spend that amount. It would be really weird if I spent that on a book. It had to be some kind of book. So it was great because it allows us to do the buddy read and me to have a copy without having to lay out a lot of cash for it. But that's digressing. Lucretius is talking, I think, about the parts of things. I don't know what understanding there was in the Roman world about how matter was made up, of what it was constructed, but there seemed to be an understanding that it was made up of smaller parts. And the English translator here has chosen to use the word atom, and I don't know whether the Latin would justify that interpretation, but nevertheless I'm going to put on screen and read one translation of this particular portion of Lucretius from which Eliot's narrator took their quote. These first beginnings have parts, but their parts are so small as not to admit of existence separate from the atom. The atom, therefore, has not been formed from a union of these parts, but they have existed in it unchangeably from eternity. Such parts, then, are but one more proof that the first beginnings are of everlasting singleness. Again, without such ultimate least things, the smallest and largest thing will alike consist of infinite parts, and thus will be equal. Again, if nature went in division beyond the atom, such least things as these parts of the atom could not have the qualities which birth-giving matter must have: weight, motion power of striking and clashing and combining. And I think this is an interesting quotation because, again, it gives this sense of almost resonance, of frequency sent out and hitting something else, which as a result does something back again. And that the very existence of all things depends upon vibrations going out, energy being sent out and energy coming back of a particular kind. And then the paragraph goes on to say that really what Rosamond and Lidgett are doing, as I've already said, is sending out social vibrations which are clashing and striking against the expectations of Middlemarch, the Middlemarch middle class, and particularly those who feel some closer connection with Rosamond. Mrs. Plymdale, because her son has tried to court Rosamond, and she thinks that if Rosamond is the kind of girl she is, she's going to need a man with money, and Ned Plymdale's probably her best prospect. And then you've got Mrs. Bulstrode, who's Rosamond's aunt, and of course feels concerned for the children, as she says to Mrs. Plymdale. She thinks they've been carelessly brought up, and therefore she worries about them. So both these women know that something is off socially, something doesn't resonate, something is not in harmony with the great bell that we call social expectations. So Mrs. Plymdale, when she voices her concern, she sends out her own vibrations to Mrs. Bulstrode, and you can see Mrs. Bulstrode's affected because Mrs. Bulstrode's interested in correct social conduct also. She and Mrs. Plymdale are agreed on this, and so as a result, Mrs. Bulstrode goes to see Rosamond with a different intention, a more weighty intention than she had when she would have first gone, which would just been for a little social call. So now, imagine how Rosamond is affected. This is really important because when it says poor Rosamond's feelings were very unpleasant on page 295, I mean, I don't think you can say that strongly enough. This is a young woman whose sole purpose for existing is to meet every tiny detail of the social expectations for her sex. That's the whole reason for all that schooling at Mrs. Lemon's. How horrifying then for her. How unbearable would it be for her to receive signals from her aunt that something about her conduct with Dr. Lidgett is not correct. On a minor note, there's also a minor vibration between Rosamond and Mrs. Bulstrode, her aunt. And that minor vibration is how they notice each other's clothing. Although Mrs. Bulstrode's a very religious woman, it's clear that she always keeps her eye on the very latest in fashion, as Rosamond does. They are both a little bit the same that way. Clothing and the appearance and how they present themselves matters. And so they spend a little time each being sort of affected by each other's clothing. Mrs. Bulstrode looks at it was called the quilling around Rosamond's bonnet, and I should have looked that up, and I tell you what, why don't I pick that up in the next episode, since I didn't do my homework there, because I'm not sure what quilling is exactly, so I need to show you an example. And then, of course, Rosamond, also, the embroidered collar that Mrs. Bulstrode is wearing, Rosamond is checking that out as well. In other words, that's hitting her. She takes a signal, perhaps, that that's something that she would desire. Mrs. Bulstrode, you see, can see the quilling on Rosamond's bonnet and thinks, I need to get something like that for my Kate. I need to get something similar. So that's a minor social vibration, but it shows these little things, as well as the bigger things, are powerful. We do respond to them. If whatever it is that we're interested in or whatever matters to us in a social capacity, whether that's music or art or sport or fashion or just what's going on in the neighborhood, we all have different things that we pick up and respond to. So in other words, we're all bells with different frequencies. And so we can be touched and hit and set vibrating by signals that come to us from different aspects of the society we live in. And Middlemarch is capturing that. It's like a little tiny close look at the vibrations going back and forth in this particular community with particular individuals. And so I think you could take that and go, oh, wow. What if you could see it becoming the inspiration for another novel? Someone could go, well, I could write a novel set in my own time, in my own place, and talk about the particular social vibrations that go out there back and forth. In fact, the novel that I will hopefully be able to review for you in September, Across the Lakes by Amal Chatterjee, does that very thing, except as it happens, the novel is set in 20th century Mumbai. But again, the particular social vibrations going back and forth, perhaps I'll try and remember that when I review the novel and give you the details of that sense of social vibration going out, clashing, going out, or causing a sympathetic response, whichever way. So Rosamond's visit with her aunt just convinces Mrs. Bulstrode that yes, something is happening here and it is wrong and it needs stopping right now. Either stopping, well, I think that's what she would like, ideally, for it to stop, because Mrs. Bulstrode knows that Mr. Lidgett is not in a financial position to get married, and she knows that this is not going to go well for Rosamond. Rosamond needs a husband with money, because Rosamond clearly has tastes, particularly in clothing, but perhaps in other objects as well that she doesn't yet have to buy, but as a wife she will. She has tastes that are quite expensive. And so Mrs. Bulstrode makes a point of interrogating her husband. So she's sending out vibrations, getting her husband to go and get some idea from Lidgett. Is he thinking of marrying? And when the answer comes back negative, she's like, okay, this is not good. This is not good. So she has to make a time with Mr. Lidgett herself, arrange some way when she can talk to him face to face. And then again, she's quite direct. And I want to say that I admire Mrs. Bulstrode. This is our first real meeting with her as a character. I admire her behavior only in this regard, because she and I would not resonate necessarily on the fashion thing, and I would find her a little bit hypocritical in that on the one hand she tries to say that she's so concerned with spiritual things. On the other hand, it's clear she's very, very concerned with the material in certain ways. But I do admire how she guides a conversation to the point that she wishes to make. Then she makes that point effectively and clearly, so the person does get the point, and then she lets the matter drop. That requires a really quick intellect and an ability to read people and the situation that you're in with that person effectively and accurately. You need to choose your words, because you've got to be careful. They've got to be clear, but they've also got to be diplomatic. You've got to be careful. No woman is allowed to just rant. That wouldn't be on. So again, you've got to do all that. And then you've got to have emotional control, because of course it would be tempting for Mrs. Bulstrode to be a little angry about this it's a little social transgression. If Mr. Lidgett doesn't intend to marry, for him to monopolize Rosamond's attentions is wrong. It is not good. It is keeping her, limiting her prospects. And as I used it as the title for today's episode, he's getting in the way of Rosamond getting herself a better husband. Lidgett, God bless him, is flustered a little irritated. Why? Because he's not keen on social conventions, and he had hoped when he came to Middlemarch that he would escape all this fussy business of, oh, you've got to do this, and you've got to look like this, and you've got to... I don't know why he thought he would escape that by going to the country. All he really escapes is the exact nature of the fussy little conventions. But this is 19th century England. It is full of fussy little conventions, and I don't think you could go anywhere. I really don't within England and not encounter. They'd just be slightly different. They differ slightly from London, and London people would despise Middlemarchers for their funny conventions, and Middlemarchers would despise Londoners. Both of them would think that the others' conventions were fussy, whereas they'd think that their own were vital for social stability and all that good stuff. And so that is where we're going to end this episode, as Mrs. Bulstrode very deftly ends a conversation that she feels she has done effectively. And hopefully I've made the point about resonances as effectively as I can. Hope you found that helpful. Okay, I'm going to go away now and focus on a script for a nonfiction review. This is a little slender work by Toni Morrison that I'm going to talk about, a nonfiction book that Elaine Castillo, in her work How to Read Now, mentioned. And she mentioned that not many people have actually read it, and that she's surprised that not many people have read it. And now that I have read it, yeah, I'm surprised. I think more people should know about it and know about the critical theory that it's putting forward. So look forward to that in the middle of the week. In the meantime, hope you all have fantastic reading and that you're taking care of yourselves. And I'll see you again very soon. Bye-bye.